challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for, yes, the Tuesday night live stream. So welcome everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it. And there's a few things that I want to get to today. So, as you know, we had a phone conversation yesterday between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And the gist of the call was Russia's threat, warning, whatever you want to call it, that the Russia is now about to undertake some very serious bombing of Kiev, and that foreign diplomats should think about leaving Kiev. And it was kind of an interesting discussion because it followed on from the attacks over the weekend that Russia had launched. You recall, this was a serious attack that that involved targets outside of Kiev, and the use of Russia's Oreshnik missile. And this was, of course, in response to the Ukrainian attack on a teachers' training college dormitory in Lugansk that led to the deaths of some 21 young people. And this is also, of course, following Rubio's comment last week, in which he said that the United States is really just departing from the entire peace process, such as it was. There really wasn't much of a peace process on Ukraine. But Rubio said that really we're not interested in taking part. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So, whoever wants to take up the cause of peace negotiations, they're welcome to do so. We might come back, we might not, depends on the circumstances, but we're not interested any longer in pursuing this. So there are obviously a number of ways of interpreting what's going on. So first, let's just take a look at the Russian readout of the call. And here we have this from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Telephone conversation took place, blah, blah. At the direction of President Putin, Sergei Lavrov officially informed the American side that in response to the Kiev regime's ongoing terrorist attacks against civilians and civilian objects on Russian territory, the Russian armed forces are launching a systematic and consistent strikes against facilities in Kiev used by the Ukrainian armed forces and against the relevant decision-making centers. Lavrov drew attention to the Russian Foreign Ministry statement on May the 25th, we'll take a look at that in a moment, which recommended that the United States, along with other states with missions in Kiev, ensure the evacuation of their diplomatic personnel and other citizens from the Ukrainian capital. And then the minister recalled the agreements reached at the highest level in Anchorage in August 2025 on the Ukrainian conflict at the U.S. proposal, and expressed regret that the brazen efforts of the European elites and the Kiev regime are undermining these agreements, which open the way to a sustainable long-term settlement based on a balance of interests. The heads of the foreign affairs agencies exchanged assessments of diplomatic initiative to overcome the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz and regarding the situation around Cuba. And then Lavrov and Rubio confirmed their mutual commitment, despite known differences, to intensify efforts to normalize working conditions of Russia and U.S. diplomatic missions on each other's territory. All right, let's take a then look at the statement from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was published also yesterday. And here, the bloody attack carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces on the academic building dormitory of the Lugansk State Pedagogical University in Starobilsk on the night of May the 22nd, using a drone system, became yet another blatant demonstration of the Nazi and terrorist nature of the Kiev regime, which deliberately attacks civilians and does not hesitate in murdering children in cold blood. Zelensky's junta and its Western sponsors, who supply the Ukrainian armed forces with the tools to commit crimes against our people, have demonstrated to the entire world their flagrant disregard for international humanitarian law, violation of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and their additional protocols, which regulate the protection of civilians during conflict in a 1989 Convention of the Child, and so on. All this has become the last straw. Under these circumstances, the Russian armed forces are launching a systematic series of strikes against Ukrainian military industrial complex facilities in Kiev, including specific sites where UAVs are designed, manufactured, programmed, prepared for use. These UAVs are used by the Kiev regime with the assistance of NATO specialists responsible for supplying components, providing intelligence, and targeting. The strikes will target both decision making centers and command posts. And then, given that the above mentioned facilities are scattered throughout Kiev, we warn foreign citizens, including personnel of diplomatic missions and international organizations, to leave the city as soon as possible, and residents of the Ukrainian capital to avoid approaching military and administrative infrastructure facilities of the Zelensky regime. Well, let's just look again at this slide in particular. It says, under these circumstances, the Russian armed forces are launching a systematic series of strikes against Ukrainian military industrial complex facilities, including specific sites where UAVs are designed, manufactured, programmed, and prepared for use. And then these UAVs are used by the Kiev regime with the assistance of NATO specialists responsible for supplying components, providing intelligence, and targeting. Now, the what's striking about that right away is first of all you think, well, why hasn't this happened before? Why now, after more than 4 years of war, is Russia planning to launch the attacks on these decision-making centers, but the UAV manufacturing facilities, and in particular, the way they're phrased. Let's just look at again the way they phrased it, which is kind of interesting. It says here, specifics are UAVs are designed, manufactured, and programmed to prepare for use. These UAVs are used by the Kiev regime with the assistance of NATO specialists responsible for supplying components, providing intelligence, and targeting. So, given that they are now issuing warnings for foreign citizens to leave Kiev, there's really an indication that these attacks will involve the killing of NATO personnel. In other words, there are NATO personnel, which we've always known, there are NATO personnel very actively operating in Kiev or in Ukraine throughout. They're involved in targeting, they're involved in training, they're involved obviously in the use of these UAVs, and of course they're involved in the manufacture of the UAVs. So Russia's really saying that we intend to hit all these targets, and the likely consequence will be the killing of NATO personnel. That, of course, is an escalation from what has happened before. And as I say, it is remarkable that it's taken this long for Russia to do this. I mean, Russia should obviously have done this a long time ago because you know, these, I mean, these are now very serious blows that Ukraine is inflicting on Russia. These are, these are now daily, hourly attacks on Russia that Ukraine is launching. Ukraine is launching with the very active collaboration of NATO and NATO personnel inside Ukraine. And so this is a warning clearly from Lavrov, from the Russian foreign ministry, that really coming within the next few days, we're going to be hitting these targets. And it's quite likely that NATO personnel who are there, even as NATO pretends that we are not a party to the conflict, that they will be hit, and that there will be the death of senior NATO figures. Now, as I say, obviously, this is something that should have happened a long time ago. And NATO has only got step by step increased its presence in Kiev, increased its active collaboration with Kiev in response to Russia's obvious lack of response. As long as Russia really wasn't doing anything very much and allowing NATO to essentially start just to hit targets inside Russia, kill Russians. NATO people based in Ukraine, killing Russians, and Russia really didn't do anything. And despite the fact that this would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, that NATO would have taken such risks, they have done so, and they've done so in response to Russia's lack of response. So here we have Lavrov and the Russian foreign ministry making clear that this lack of response era, which has gone on for more than 4 years, is now coming to an end. Now, obviously, we can't know whether this is indeed going to happen. I mean, this is not the first time Russia has issued all kinds of threats. This is the red line. This is it. We're really going to hit the Ukraine very hard. But it does seem that that up until now, Russia has been very reluctant to kill NATO personnel. I mean, it was that this is something that was was seen to be a very dangerous move, because Russia really couldn't be sure how NATO and how, in particular, the United States would respond. So there was always a risk that NATO would really take it very much amiss if NATO personnel started, getting killed as a result of Russian attacks. So Russia has been very reluctant. Russia has, of course, is by nature quite rather a cautious power. Always has been rather cautious, but obviously they've kind of sensed that enough is enough, and I think there's been plenty of commentary in the past few days. Even going back really a few weeks, suggesting that Russians are already getting fed up with this war, and really beginning to get fed up with Putin's leadership, or lack of leadership, or lack of any real willingness to bring this war to any kind of a successful conclusion. And that suddenly now Putin is beginning to feel the heat from Russian public opinion. It was always likely to happen, but it now looks as if it's the Russians have decided to step up. Now, one of the factors I think obviously that's playing a role here is America's disenchantment with Europe and America's really kind of exasperation with this um, war, with this exasperation, with this failure to come to any kind of a resolution, and particularly that the Americans getting fed up with the fact that the Europeans are seeking to push them into a war with with against Russia. In other words, the Europeans who think that they can just keep antagonizing Russia, keep provoking Russia, in the hope that the United States and Russia will eventually get themselves into a war, and then Europe will just simply stand back and distance themselves. Um, and that's, I think, the context in which you have to see that comment of Rubio's from last week, in which he said, we're out of here. We don't want to do this thing for the this is the Europeans. What if this is the Europeans' war? It isn't our war. That's what Trump is saying. Now, of course, we can always say that it was the Americans who had initially pushed for that war. True. It was the Americans who had initially pushed the Europeans into that war. True. But Trump just doesn't identify this as his war. He just thinks that this was Biden's war. It's not his war, and there's no point in arguing. Oh yeah, but it's the Americans' war, and all that Trump is still providing arms to the Europeans who are providing them to Ukraine, or that Trump is providing intelligence to Ukraine with which they're using to hit targets inside Russia. That is all true, but that doesn't negate the fact that this administration is fed up with the Europeans, is fed up with this war, and they've got other fish to fry. They need to resolve this problem in with Iran. So this was he was Rubio's comment last week, and here he says that he's asked, have the peace negotiations under American leadership in Ukraine stall, and do you think the Europeans should take over? And said, yeah, the peace negotiations on Ukraine under American leadership, let me just say that we got involved, okay, because we were told that we were the only ones that could do it. We were the only ones that the Russians and the Ukrainians would talk to, so we got involved. They were not fruitful, unfortunately. We stand ready to continue to play that role, despite leaks that are not true, despite stories out there about us forcing the Ukrainians to take this position or that position, which are not true. If we see an opportunity to pull together talks that are productive, not counterproductive, and that have the chance to be fruitful, we're prepared to play that role. There are no such talks occurring at this time, but we hope that will change, because that war can only end with a negotiated settlement. It will not end up with a military victory on either side or the other, at least from a traditional standpoint of how military victories are defined. So it will have to, and if we can play a role in making that happen, the president is very much interested in doing it. We just, over the last few months, just sort of sensed that there wasn't a lot of progress being made, but maybe dynamics will change, and if they do, we stand ready to play whatever constructive role we can play. If someone else would like to handle, they should, but there doesn't appear to be anybody else in the world right now that can handle it. So we're more than happy to do that if the opportunity presents itself to have constructive and productive talks. We're also not interested in getting involved in an endless cycle of meetings that lead to nothing. All right, so they basically said, we're not really interested in this. It's the Europeans' war. Let the Europeans deal with it. we're just not. If there's any real prospect of serious negotiations, then we'll get involved, but we won't. So that, as I say, this is consistent with the way Trump has seen um, the war in Ukraine. Now, from the Russians' point of view, that's a very interesting development, and going together with the United States' problems in the Middle East, the United States, having difficulties, to say the least, the inability to get itself out of the mess that it created for itself, and now saying, well, we're just not interested in Ukraine. This is the opportunity for Russia really to bring its its huge industrial and military capability to bear against Ukraine. So all the hesitations that it may have entertained in the past about provoking NATO, leading to an unfortunate escalation, an unfortunate spiraling of a war between Russia and NATO, that is now unlikely. No, it can't be ruled out. It could still happen, but it can't be ruled out. And then on top of that, we had the whole issue during the past week that we've discussed here at some length, with the question of the drones, and whatever the dynamics were with the drones, it was clear that that there was clearly a European plan to provoke Russia and thereby to provoke the United States. It was a very ill-conceived plan, because this now was absolutely the wrong time to do so, because the United States just isn't watching Ukraine. It's just not interested in Ukraine. It's completely preoccupied with Iran. And so therefore it's not going to get itself terribly worked up about what's going on there. So, and that was made clear, particularly in that UN Security Council debate, when there was a lot of shrieking, particularly from Latvia, who is apparently a member of the UN Security Council at the moment, one of the non-permanent members of the Security Council, but nonetheless a voting member, and was blustering away about how it's being threatened by Russia. And the United States really made clear it's not going to get involved. In other words, the plan, and the European plan is always the same: to provoke Russia, hoping that somehow Russia will overstep the mark, will somehow react excessively, and that would provoke the United States. So they could say, Article 5 must go into effect. If we don't invoke Article 5, if we don't do something about what Russia has just done, then NATO is no more. And this is the little game the Europeans are playing. They've been playing this now for some time. And the United States made clear that we're not going to do this. We're not going to get involved on behalf of the Baltic states, who had obviously been colluding with Ukraine in order to hit targets in Russia, hoping that Russia will retaliate and bring us, the United States, into this war. We're not playing this game. The United States made that clear. In other words, you are on your own to face Russia. This was obviously this was a blow to their plans, and we've now seen the hysterical responses that are emanating from Europe, and the usual bluster and we had von der Leyen and in Lithuania today, doing the usual kind of, well, I have to express some solidarity. We have to express solidarity with the Baltic states. So at von der Leyen in Lithuania, but again, talking very much of this sort of big blustery talk, even though it, that that uh, what triggered the most recent crisis was the Ukrainian drones coming down in a number of the Baltic states. And but von der Leyen and all the bluster from the EU and NATO, that they want to make you think that somehow it's the Russians who are launching drones against NATO, and and then waging the disinformation campaign by suggesting that, heaven forbid, the Baltic states allowed their airspace to be used by Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia. Um, Now, the warning that came from Russia, from the one we were talking about earlier, from Lavrov and the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and why I think they have to take this quite serious, and I think they are taking this seriously, is precisely because they're getting a sense they're on their own. The United States is really very much preoccupied with Iran, and will be for some time. There's no peace on the horizon in the Middle East. Maybe there is, but even if the ceasefire is extended, there's going to be very detailed, intricate negotiations that will go on for a month, 2 months, who knows. I mean, these things drag on for a long time. So during this time, the United States isn't going to get itself very bothered about Ukraine. I mean, apart from anything else, Trump can't stand Zelensky. Trump can't stand Ukraine. Trump can't stand the Europeans. Macron, Merz, Starmer. He just hates these people. So this isn't the right time to start egging on the Americans to stand up to Putin. And that's why I think the Europeans are really very, very upset, because if Russia does launch these attacks really within the next day or so, that involve the killing of NATO personnel, because that could start, a number of Germans, Brits, Frenchmen, Dutch, Belgians could get themselves killed. Then the United States will say, well, that was your problem, too bad. You were given fair warning. And so I think it was very striking. Lavrov initiated this phone call with Rubio. He called Rubio. He told Rubio that we're going to be hitting Kiev really in the coming days, and it would be advisable for foreign diplomats to get out of Kiev. And then when we looked at the foreign ministry statement, they said, look, well, these are going to be our targets. We're going to be hitting the headquarters. We're going to be hitting a lot more targets than we were before. But above all, we're going to be hitting those UAV factories in which there are NATO personnel. And so therefore, this is clearly causing real um, anguish in Europe because they could get themselves killed, and they're not going to be able to invoke Article 5, and they're not even going to be able to elicit much interest from the United States. So today was a day in which there was a lot of bluster coming from the Europeans. And the bluster was that, hey, you're telling us that we should leave Kiev. We're not leaving Kiev. Well, them's brave words. We don't know whether that they're actually going to act on that or whether they're secretly already shipping people out. I suspect they are secretly shipping out, despite all the blustery statements. But clearly, the Europeans are quite concerned about what the next couple of days have in store. So here is the a statement from the EU spokeswoman, Anita Hipper. Russian threat to foreign citizens and diplomats to leave Kiev is an unacceptable escalation. So you remember becoming a party to the conflict, getting directly involved with Ukraine, hitting targets inside Russia. That's not an escalation. The EU, external whatever service summoned that's the Kaya Kalas's department, summoned the charge d'affaires, calling to stop hitting civilians and Russia to engage in genuine peace talks, starting with a full and unconditional ceasefire. So, genuine peace talk, starting with a full and unconditional ceasefire. EU delegation stays in Kiev. All right, so of course they're not serious about it. They know they've already been told Russia's not going to accept a ceasefire, and they know this perfectly well. That there's nothing new about this. They've been demanding this full and unconditional ceasefire. Of course, they they don't actually mean unconditional. They mean they're going to use the ceasefire in order to transport troops and armed personnel, weapons, ammunition, everything into Ukraine during the time of the ceasefire. So it's not on the table. They know it's not on the table. But the Europeans have been playing a very dangerous game here, because what they've been doing is precisely the provocation. So we have the provocations that was involved in these drone attacks, and the provocation which was using Baltic airspace in order to hit targets in Russia, and then of course we had the provocation of the attack on the teachers training college dormitory in Lugansk. Now, the way provocations work is that the Europeans feel that they have nothing to lose. If Russia fails to act, then essentially that discredits Putin, that discredits the Russian government. The Russian people become more and more disenchanted, disillusioned with their government, and public protest against the government will begin to rise, and then there'll be a danger of a coup, the disintegration of Russia, and so on. So that's one possibility if Russia doesn't do anything in the face of the provocation. The other possibility is that if Russia does do something against the provocation, it may overreact. And then, of course, if it overreacts, then NATO can do the Article 5 routine. But the second option has to have the key ingredient, namely that the Americans are on board. Now, during the Biden era, they were pretty confident, probably complacently confident, because I don't think they could count on Biden to such an extent, that if Russia were to react excessively and to start hitting targets very seriously in Kiev, knocking out military and intelligence headquarters, and even more importantly, killing Zelensky. Killing the key figures in the Ukrainian government. They could count that if Russia did that, then the United States would get involved, and then there'd be World War III, and the Russians would back down because Russia doesn't really want to take on the United States. Now, that's very that was always a gamble, and whichever way you look at it, it is a gamble. But that was nonetheless the European plan. So we can't lose. I mean, in a way, NATO expansion was always a provocation in which NATO believed that they can't lose. Either Russia doesn't react, and therefore, essentially, Russia becomes completely surrounded by NATO. Russia, in effect, ceases to be any kind of a serious power in the world. I mean, remember, during the time of the bombing of Yugoslavia in '99, there was a real issue. Well, what's Russia going to do about helping Serbia, their great, little brother? The people that they're supposed to care about. That the Serbs are Russia's little brother. They went to war on the Serbs' behalf in 1914. So the question, well, what's Russia going to do about it? Well, Russia said, yeah, well, we're going to try and provide some kind of, airlift. Maybe a humanitarian airlift, maybe an airlift of weapons. And lo and behold, all of the European states said, no, we're not granting you overflight rights. You can't use our airspace to assist Serbia. And then you could see Russia is now an insignificant power because they're not able to project power. They're not able to even provide humanitarian assistance to their little brother. And that's what will happen once you're surrounded by NATO. You're not able to do anything because, essentially, everywhere you look, there's NATO. Everywhere you look, you have a hostile state, and they're not going to give you anything. On the contrary, they will be locations of NATO missiles, NATO weapons, NATO personnel, and NATO hostile intent. So that's what happens if Russia doesn't react. If Russia does react, then it gets itself into a very messy war, which, of course, the Ukraine war has been a very, very messy, very, very difficult war for Russia. So for the Europeans, NATO, this has been it's win-win. If they don't react, they cease to be a power. Fantastic. If they do react, they get themselves into a very difficult war, and as a result of which, again, there might no longer be a power. So something similar has taken place now. You keep provoking. If they don't react to the provocations, then essentially there's going to be some kind of a collapse of morale, a collapse of Russia's military capability. If they do react, then there's a real possibility of a war with NATO. That's the calculation. So that's why everything really hangs on, well, how does Trump deal with this? And so far, and again, it's always this is all very, very speculative. With Trump, everything is very speculative. We just don't know which way he's going to go. So far, Trump is indicating to Russia and to the Europeans, we're staying out. Russia and the Europeans, you're going to have to resolve this issue amongst yourselves. So here, as I say, this is this foreign minister, and sorry, or rather the spokesperson. And then now this is this Katarina Maternova is the EU's ambassador to Ukraine. So she says Russia threatens diplomats and foreigners again, asking us to leave Kiev. Now, of course, Russia isn't threatening them. They just say, it's probably to your advantage that you leave. But we are not going anywhere. Today's statement of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I think she's deliberately writing Russian with a lowercase r, because of the second time she's done that. It is a masterpiece of hypocrisy. A regime that has spent years bombing residential buildings, museums, maternity wards, schools, and power stations now suddenly speaks of the language of international humanitarian law and Geneva Conventions. Again, not as we've discussed before, not one of these European leaders, not one, said anything about the attack on clearly a civilian target, which was the college dormitory. No one, not one person within the European governing elite said anything about that. Now they're getting shrieking about Russia's retaliation. Now, the same regime that launches nightly missile and drone attacks on civilians now warns others to stay away. We understand exactly what this means. Russia wants fear, panic, isolation of Ukraine. It will not work. EU is not going anywhere. We're staying in Kiev. We are staying with Ukraine. Threats against diplomats and international organizations are not a sign of strength, a sign of desperation, blah, blah, blah. All right, the more aggressive and threatening the Kremlin becomes, the clearer it is that Putin's regime understands it cannot break Ukraine's resilience, nor the support of partners. Okay. Anyway, so that's that. And then we have the story in Politico. EU summons Russian envoy over threats against European diplomats in Kiev. And then here we have the EU on Tuesday summoned Moscow's top diplomatic representative Brussels. And then there was, during a press briefing, this HIPAA, the one we just saw, accused Russia of trying to sow panic with its warning. They want fear and isolation in Ukraine and elsewhere, but we have a clear message: this will not work. The EU is maintaining its presence and operation in Kiev, and these threats smell like desperation. European diplomats stationed in the Ukrainian capital have refused to comply with Moscow's suggestion they leave the city. And then a spokesperson for France's foreign ministry similarly told France Info that it would be out of the question to evacuate its staff from Kiev. And then we have the Poland's foreign ministry condemning Russia's warning. German foreign office told Politico Russia's threat to foreign nationals shows that Russia remains committed to escalation, and so on. And then we have Johann Vadeful, the German foreign minister, told Bloomberg TV that Berlin would not be intimidated by this. And then diplomats from more than 70 countries on Monday joined Ukraine's foreign minister Andriy to visit the site of this weekend strike. Now, remember, the site of the weekend strikes, basically, there were four people killed. That's by Ukrainians. That's Ukraine's claims. 4 people killed, and 70 diplomats went to visit this. Some 21 very young Russians were killed through the attack on Lugansk. 21. So 4 here, 21 there. No one gave a damn about the Russians who were killed. 21 Russians, or young people, basically. There wasn't even remotely a military target. Didn't care at all. And then, but because of this 70 people. So you can see this is really escalating into something quite extraordinary. They go of 70 to visit the site of these attacks, even though, let's say, 4 were killed. So they kind of sense, they are sensing that some kind of an escalation is on hand. And they've brought this on themselves, this escalation, and they really don't know, have any other option, because they don't, it's always escalation. They don't really understand anything else but escalation. And what they're hoping for is, of course, that this will persuade the Americans. Now, while the Europeans were sounding off about we're not leaving, there's been no word from the Americans. We don't know whether the Americans are leaving. We don't know whether the Americans are staying. But there's been no word at all. Once again, the Americans are just not buying into this reckless provocation, the provocative game that the Europeans are playing. And anyway, so here we have a number of representatives from EU countries took part in the tour, among them officials Sweden, Austria, Ireland, and Lithuania. And here's von der Leyen. I want to praise the resilience of the Baltic people. You have responded with calm and responsibility and with a clear message to Russia. You will fail. I'm in Vilnius to send a clear message. Europe stands in full solidarity and unity with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and we are stepping up our support, because when Baltic states are being tested, Europe as a whole is being tested. Again, all this, which is all this vast hot air, which explicitly denies to an unsuspecting public, or explicitly obfuscates, rather, to an unsuspecting public, that the only drones that have been attacking the Baltic states are emanating from Ukraine. There are no Russian drones attacking the Baltic states. And there is blustering von der Leyen, who said, oh, we're standing with your Baltic states, who launched the drones that have hit the Baltic states. So this is all. This is, as I say, this is all part of this provocation game that the Europeans are playing. Very dangerous game, and that's why the warning that was issued by the Russians is a dangerous one. They're obviously taking it seriously, and one hopes that Russia will, for once, actually follow up on its threats. Because, of course, if it doesn't follow up on its threats, and that has happened before, then, you look like a right bloody Charlie. I mean, you have to, you can't threaten and then not follow up on it, because then no one takes you seriously. And that's what has happened. And in a way, why the von der Leyens and the Kaja Kallases that are getting away with all their tweets and their blustery statements, the only reason they're getting away with it is that Russia hasn't followed up. And so they take this as weakness on Russia's part. And the natural thinking that, well, they can go on playing this little game forever. Anyways, so that's von der Leyen. And then here's the Poles. That's Radek Sikorski and his band of jerks, in connection with the statement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation calling on foreign citizens, including diplomatic staff, to immediately leave Kiev due to plans to carry out strikes on military targets and decision-making centers. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland declares that it continues to regard all attacks on Ukraine, including those against civilian facilities and populations, as acts of unjustified aggression resulting in enormous human losses and infrastructural damage. All right. And then, if Russia, as it claims, is not conducting a war, but rather a so called special military operation, which by definition should be limited in scope to military targets, then any attacks on other infrastructure, including diplomatic missions, should be treated as hostile acts. Any strikes on Poland's diplomatic missions will therefore be considered deliberate and intentional. Now, that's very, very interesting because, of course, the Russians didn't say they were going to attack the diplomatic missions. They said diplomatic personnel and various international personnel should leave. So they didn't say we're going to hit diplomatic missions. And I think the reason for that is that Russia knows, and everybody in Europe knows, and the United States knows, NATO is very actively involved in fighting this war. There's a huge NATO presence in Kiev, and has been for a long time, and Russia hasn't done anything about it. And there's a huge NATO presence, and these attacks that Russia threatens are coming could well lead to the deaths of senior NATO figures. You know, there have been rumors in the past, as you know, which have never really been borne out, that NATO generals have been killed, and 15 NATO generals are dead in Ukraine. They were never true, but there may come a point when indeed NATO generals complacently hanging out with Zelensky may find themselves killed. So Russia never said we're going to hit diplomatic missions. Anyway, then he goes on. The actions of the Russian Federation carry serious consequences under international law, once again undermining its role as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We call on Russia to immediately cease its unjustified, unlawful aggression and to comply with its international commitments and treaties. And again, what exactly is Poland doing to comply with international commitments and treaties? Anyway, here's The Guardian. Germany summons Russian ambassador over attacks on Ukraine. Germany is the latest country to summon the Russian ambassador over attacks in Ukraine, and requests for foreign diplomats to leave the capital in the city of Kiev. And then the Netherlands joins in. Meanwhile, the Netherlands has also summoned the Russian ambassador to the country over Moscow's warnings about planned attacks on Kiev. So that's EU, Norway, Germany, and now the Netherlands, all calling on the top Russian diplomats. And then we have the skies above the Baltic states are not sufficiently secure, Lithuanian president says after tensions with Russia. And then it goes, they're saying Lithuanian president Gitanas Nausėda says the drone incursions were a direct consequence of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Yet another reminder of how close the war is to us. But as we say, the drone incursions were from Ukraine. So he kind of evades it. Oh, they're a direct consequence of Russian aggression. Well, what were these Ukrainian drones doing in Baltic airspace? And then he makes it very clear as to what he thinks of Moscow's rhetoric. I want to state very clearly that the Baltic states have not allowed and will not allow their territory or airspace to be used for attacks against other countries. All Kremlin attempts to shift the responsibility to others are cynical propaganda designed to divert attention from the fundamental fact that it was Russia that launched the brutal and illegal war against Ukraine. But there's still the question here. What were these Ukrainian drones doing in your airspace? The Baltic states have not allowed and will not allow their territory or airspace. And as I've said many times before, that doesn't answer any of the questions. You may not have allowed it. You may not have given formal permission. There's no legal written document saying, yeah, you can do it. So, you could have looked the other way. Ukraine made sure not to ask for permission, and then you could say, we never allowed it. Did you do anything, however, to stop it? You knew this was happening. Everybody knew it was happening. Did you do anything to stop it? And if you didn't do anything to stop it, then effectively you allowed it. So they're playing this kind of this little verbal game through with these lawyerly evasions, and they all repeat the same line because they have to. Otherwise, the public, and particularly in Europe, and particularly in the United States, will say, yeah, you kind of got yourself into this mess by yourself, since you're actively colluding with Ukraine, and therefore you're a legitimate target for Russia. And there's von der Leyen. When Baltic states are being tested, Europe as a whole is being tested. She says these things. I mean, they don't mean anything. The European Commission, von der Leyen, begins by acknowledging the Baltic states have been experiencing what many believe belonged to another era. Air raid alerts, families sheltering, schools closing, transport interrupted. That's the reality of Europe's eastern border in 2026. Today it is here, tomorrow it will be elsewhere along the eastern border. She warns this is a deliberate strategy from Russia trying to destabilize our democratic societies. But all of this hiding in cellars and whatever, it's as a result of Ukrainian drones. It's a result of NATO drones. It's NATO that is attacking the Baltic states. NATO that is then shooting down NATO drones in NATO airspace. So she wants to say it's about Russia, but it's NATO. These are NATO drones that are threatening the citizens of a NATO country. That's the dishonesty, and that NATO is doing this with a view to provoking Russia and with a view to triggering some kind of a war with between Russia and the United States. Your basic problem, as I said, is the Americans aren't playing along with it for the time being. There's no guarantee that Europe's game will fail. It's possible that the Americans will change their mind. So far, it isn't working. Hence the sort of the somewhat hysterical bluster when one after another of these plans simply hasn't worked out for the Europeans. And so anyway, here we are. She says the EU must be clear about what it means. These are not isolated incidents. This is a deliberate strategy. Russia trying to destabilize our democratic societies. Blah, blah, blah. Europe stands in full solidarity, and so on and so forth. And then then we have again this Latvia's president who says, one thing I also want to reiterate what presidents all said, that Latvia, like Lithuania or Estonia, has not given any permission to use airspace or the territory for such attacks. Well, nobody said that you gave permission. So it's a very loyally evasive, devious, deceitful, dishonest way of formulating it. Oh, well, we never gave permission. No, you didn't give permission, but you allowed it to happen. So that's the we'll see what happens. We'll see whether the Russians will indeed this time decide that they need to follow through, because it's very important that they follow through on their threats. Because if they don't, then I think there's going to be more and more of these staged provocations. Anyway, the other thing what I would deal with Ukraine is, you may have seen that Ukraine kind of engaged in the reburial of Andriy Melnyk, who was of course one of the founders of OUN, the Ukrainian nationalist organization that, of course, collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. So there were OUN was founded by Andriy Melnyk and Stepan Bandera, and then they split off. They went their separate ways. So there was OUN Bear that was led by Bandera, and then there was OUN M that was led by Melnyk. And of course, they both collaborated. Both factions of OUN collaborated with the Nazis. And of course, most important, and this from the Nazis' point of view, what was really important was that they would collaborate in their war crimes. They would be they comprised the auxiliary forces, because for the Nazis it was very important to spread responsibility for their crimes onto others. And so OUN B and OUN M believed that if they showed their usefulness to the Nazis as they went on a kind of a rampage against the Jews, against the Poles, and against Russians, then the Nazis would look upon them with gratitude and sympathy and admiration and give them their independent Ukrainian state. Now, of course, Hitler had no real intention to grant OUN an independent Ukrainian state. He really didn't care very much about the Ukrainians. He saw Ukrainians much as the Germans, the Imperial Germany, had seen the Ukrainians as being a very useful weapon with which to fight the Russians. And so whenever when the subject of independence for Ukraine came up, Hitler flatly refused. And that was obvious why he would refuse, because Hitler's idea was that he was just he had to win this war. He had to win that war on the Eastern Front. I mean, he realized his fate, Germany's fate, the outcome of World War II depended on victory on the Eastern Front. And for that purpose, he really needed to exploit the Soviet Union, the Soviet people, the Soviet territory, Soviet resources, everything. He had to exploit all of that to the maximum extent possible. Steal all the food from the peasants, use factories for themselves, for the Germans, and then, of course, extract everything, whatever resources were there, just to extract everything for the German war machine. And if there was to be an independent Ukrainian state, then it would be a kind of a problem, because then you would have to depend on whoever was in charge in Kiev, granting Germany permission to do this, that, or the other. He had no intention. He intended Germany to run Ukraine. He had no intention of ceding power to somebody else. Germany would run Ukraine, and it did run Ukraine under as Gauleiter Erich Koch. But nonetheless, Melnyk and Bandera and their people will prove themselves to be very useful, because they did take part in the worst atrocities during Germany's occupation in Ukraine. And then, of course, they continued after the war, particularly fighting against the restoration of Soviet power after 1945. And so this really continued for some years. And of course, they also committed terrible atrocities against Russians, again, after 1945. And then, of course, Bandera particularly was used by the Western intelligence services. I think it was MI6, the Germans, Bundesnachrichtendienst. I mean, they all financed the activities of Bandera. And he lived in Munich really until the late 1950s, until he was assassinated by the KGB. Melnyk wasn't. I think Melnyk, he wasn't as prominent as Bandera. Anyway, he died some years later, and even though he was quite a bit older than Bandera. And anyway, Melnyk was buried in Luxembourg, and now his body and that of his wife were transported from Luxembourg into Ukraine, and now he was lying in state. This is a Nazi collaborator responsible for atrocities. He's lying in state um, in Ukraine, and Zelensky takes the knee. There are pictures of Zelensky taking the knee before Melnyk, and and then Zelensky was talking about, well, what a great man and whatnot. So great man, a Nazi collaborator. So the issue of the sort of the Nazi origins of Ukrainian nationalism has always been a bit of an embarrassment to the Western liberals who have embraced the cause of Ukraine. So first they denied that this was true. No, it's absolutely, this is just Russian propaganda. These are all just lies. Putin is lying. When you can no longer deny it, then you try to minimize it. And so it's not really very important. But obviously, you really can't have Nazis being worshipped. And so you then have, when this happens, remember, these are Nazis are being worshipped here by a state that is financed by billions upon billions, hundreds of billions of Western money has poured into Ukraine. And and more money is being promised to Zelensky. We got the 90 billion that the EU just signed off on, and then the Germans send them money of their own, and the Americans, of course, give them money. And you're giving all this money, this is taxpayer money, to a state that worships Nazis. I think this is an absolute outrage. And of course, it's particularly outrageous given that it just sort of flies under the radar. A reburial, as if there's some great hero, a saintly figure in Ukrainian history of a Nazi collaborator. And that his organization was directly responsible for horrific atrocities during World War II. These are all undeniable. These are extensively written about by Western historians. That doesn't matter what the Russians are saying. Western historians have recorded the activities not just of Bandera, but of Melnyk. So and there's Zelensky taking the knee to this, and you recall the guy in the Canadian Parliament, and they almost got away with it. Remember, they tried to pull a fast one. They said, "Oh, this fantastic guy, great guy, he's still alive." He fought against the Russians during World War II, and there they were, all the Canadian parliamentarians, leapt to their feet to give the guy a standing ovation. And it was obvious who it was, and it was the Canadian professor who it took him after the ceremony was over to point out who this guy was, what organization that he belonged to, that he belonged to the Waffen SS. So, he was fighting against the Russian. He was he was fighting in the Waffen SS. You're stamping your feet and giving him a standing ovation to, he's not, this is not some sweet old man. He was fighting for the Waffen SS. Now, of course, what was interesting about that episode was that, you know, Zelensky was, of course, clapping excitedly. He was there at the Canadian Parliament, as was the, 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 the former Canadian foreign minister. God, all right. I think everybody knows who I'm talking about. The Canadian foreign minister. Anyway, big. Now, she, like Zelensky, knew exactly. I mean, leave aside Trudeau. Yeah, Trudeau. He doesn't really know, but they knew exactly who this person was, and they were clapping and clapping and clapping and so on until this a professor pointed out who this person was, what the organization was that he was working for. Then they go, and then of course there was an apology, or somebody had to. I think the Speaker of the Parliament had to fall on his sword. Oh, we didn't, sorry, we didn't, it was just a misunderstanding, or blah, 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 blah. Yeah. But that's, and so here we are. Apparently, we've got another misunderstanding on our hands. It's just a misunderstanding. We have the reburial in Ukraine of a Nazi collaborator. So here's the story in the New York Times today. And here we have, note the anodyne headline. In Ukraine, a divisive 20th century hero comes home. Andriy Melnyk criticized as a Nazi collaborator. Oh, he was criticized. Well, you don't get to be criticized as a Nazi collaborator. Either you're a Nazi collaborator or you're not a Nazi. That's a factual matter. It's not a matter for criticism. Criticized as a Nazi collaborator and lionized as an anti-Soviet resistance leader, was given state honors for his reburial near Kiev. Okay, so, so he's given state honors. Even the Times kind of, sheepishly says, well, Nazi collaborator, but he criticized. But he's lionized and is an anti-Soviet resistance leader. Well, if that's going to be your criterion as an anti-Soviet leader, then of course, you're in the business of worshiping Hitler, because there's nobody who was quite as vigorous and as by the way, the foreign minister I was thinking of is, of course, Krista Freeland. Just her name momentarily escaped me. Krista Freeland. But the reason why I think it's important to point out about Freeland, because Freeland came from a very activist, a Ukrainian nationalist activist family. And so she knew exactly who this person was, who was being given a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament. And yet there she was. You can see it on YouTube. There she was giving this excited, enthusiastic applause to somebody who fought with the Waffen SS. Anyway, back to the New York Times. And here with that, with blah, blah. And then we have the remains of the long dead World War II era Ukrainian leader were exhumed in Luxembourg, where he had been buried after dying in exile in 1964. So he died, as I said, he died a few years after Bandera. And returned to Ukraine. There was none of the raw grief of today's war funeral. So the Times has to get, none of that raw grief. No. Today's funerals, they have a raw grief. There wasn't a raw grief. Well, no one's saying that there should be raw grief. I mean, the guy's been dead for more than 60 years. Melnyk led one of the two factions of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, including through a period of alignment with the Nazi army during its occupation of Ukraine, which was one of the bloodiest chapters of World War II. All right, now remember, all this time, this has been more of the media more or less denied this. This is Russian propaganda, yeah, Putin, Putin, Putin. They kind of have to say this is nothing. This is nothing to do with Putin. This is a historical record. You can look up in any academic historical study, and they will tell you about Melnyk, and they will tell you about the two factions of OUN. And the bloodiest chapters of World War II. The Soviet Union signed a non aggression pact with Germany in 1939 and was caught by surprise 2 years later when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, then Soviet territory. Ukrainians had suffered under Soviet rule, and many initially saw the Nazis as liberators. Well, first of all, they bring up about the non-aggression pact. Fine, that's correct. And then they say it was caught by surprise. How do they know it was caught by surprise? The Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact in order to buy itself time. They were buying themselves time, much the same way that Great Britain was buying itself time at Munich, because you wanted to delay fighting the Wehrmacht for as long as possible. That doesn't mean it was caught by surprise. Everything that Stalin did between 1939 and 1941 was in anticipation of the German attack. That's why he took the three Baltic states. That's why he took the eastern provinces of Poland. That's why he took the provinces of Romania. In other words, he was in preparation for this attack. So to say, oh, it was caught by surprise, the suggestion there is that somehow they were in on it together. And when they were never in on it together. This was a non-aggression pact. It was not a, there was, there was not an alliance. It was a non-aggression pact, which was violated by Germany. Yeah, that's somewhere it said. Yeah. And here we have that saw the Nazis as liberators. All right, factions from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and its insurgent army fought alongside the Nazis in what they viewed as a struggle for Ukrainian sovereignty. Members of those groups also took part in atrocities against Jewish and Polish civilians. Later in the war, some of the groups fought against the Nazis. This anodyne language is just extraordinary. Factions from OUN and its insurgent army, this is the UPA, that's the insurgent army, fought alongside the Nazis in what they viewed as a struggle for Ukrainian sovereignty. What does that mean? They fought alongside the Nazi army. What was the Nazi army? That they thought, oh well, we have the Nazi army. Oh well, let's fight alongside. Have a good time. We just in sovereignty. They fought along the side of the Nazi army. What was the Nazi army doing in the Soviet Union? It was waging a war of annihilation. I mean, does anyone doubt that? Well, apparently, the New York Times seems to doubt that it was waging a war of annihilation. It launched a completely unprovoked. Now, if you want an unprovoked war, that's the classic unprovoked war. So you have a they were taking part in a war of annihilation, and they were doing a lot of annihilating, some serious annihilating. So they said, oh well, they took part in the war of Ukrainian national sovereignty. Well, let's take a look. July 1941, Bandera declares an independent state of Ukraine. The Nazis immediately um, cancel that declaration and say, no, there's not going to be any independent state of Ukraine. So that was already obvious in July 1941. There's not going to be an independent state of Ukraine. So basically, but you can join us on our violent rampage in the Soviet Union. But he's like, well, they were, this was, they were, they saw as national sovereignty. What national sovereignty? What national sovereignty was there during World War II for Ukraine? Where's the national sovereignty? There wasn't any. It was run by a Nazi Gauleiter, Erich Koch. And then here we have the faction, blah, 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 and it's our fault. Many Polish and civilians. Later in the war, some of the groups fought against the Nazis. Oh well, that's but they were fighting against the Russians. That was that was where their real focus was, particularly when the Red Army was sweeping westward. As he was under arrest in Germany through most of the war, Melnyk's degree of culpability in the Holocaust and murderous fight with ethnic Poles in Western Ukraine in 1945 has divided historians ever since. Well, these were own people who were fighting alongside the Germans. His body lay in state in the towering Greek Catholic Cathedral of the Resurrection of Christ of Kiev before being transferred to a final resting place in a new military cemetery outside the city. That's nice. Before Russia's all-out invasion, the ceremony would have been a risky move by any Ukrainian politician who wanted to win votes from Russian speakers. But during the war, Ukrainians have embraced more tightly all symbols of Ukrainian independence, and Mr. Zelensky has moved with them. This is, of course, a complete lie, because the rehabilitation of Bandera began long before 2022. The rehabilitation of Bandera, the renaming of streets after Bandera, putting up of statues to Bandera. Just take a look. Do a quick Google search. How many statues to Bandera have been erected in Ukraine since 2004? That was 2004 was, of course, the Orange Revolution and the stealing, outright theft of that election in 2004. That was when they began the rehabilitation of Bandera and Melnyk and Oun. And so therefore, to say, oh, well, it was only 2022, that's a lie. That's absolute lie. Absolute lie. The rehabilitations began long before that. And so, and Mr. Zelensky with them. And then something that Ukrainians have long hoped for was underway, he said, as the cremated remains were en route back to Ukraine. He described Melnyk and his wife, Sofia Fedak Melnyk, who was reburied beside her husband, as, quote, iconic Ukrainians of the 20th centuries who are deeply respected. Okay, so that's Nazi collaborators who are deeply respected. To be sure, right-wing parties have had historically low support in Ukraine, and none cleared the threshold to enter parliament in the last election before the invasion in 2019. But Mr. Zelensky's embrace of Melnyk, a figure previously revered most fervently by the right, is telling of a wartime shift, an unintended consequence of the war for Russia. Okay, so in other words, what they're trying to say here is that, oh well, it's really the Russians' fault. The Ukrainians are complete. They didn't do anything wrong. It's because of the Russia. Well, that of course is a lie, because while it is true that these characters, Tyanibok and the rest, these not essentially Nazi sympathizers. It's true that they didn't do well electorally. They were nonetheless very, very influential, as in Ukraine, as in many countries. You don't actually have to win elections to be a very influential figure. They were highly influential in Ukraine, even though people didn't vote for them. Um, and hey, who won these elections? Well, Yanukovych won the elections. Look what happened to Yanukovych. Twice, Yanukovych was overthrown. So it doesn't matter. Oh, well, they didn't really vote. Oh, well, they didn't vote. Yeah, it doesn't matter who votes in Ukraine. The result is always the same. And and Zelensky, who, of course, and everybody's saying, "Oh, well, he's a Jew. He's Jewish." Well, if he's Jewish, well, he can't. How can you call Ukraine Nazi? Well, you call Ukraine Nazi because Ukraine worships Nazis. That's why you call it Nazi. It doesn't matter whether he's Jewish or he can't be Jewish. And this was the lie the New York Times has been peddling for years, and everybody. This is this kind of the liberal bien pensant who say, no, 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 he can't possibly be Nazi because he's Jewish. He's a Jew. Well, that the Jewish thing was always only one part of the Nazi ideology. There was a lot of other things that you could be a part of. Russophobia was very much a part of the Nazi ideology, and so that was okay. Uh, so that didn't really matter. But if you rebury Melnyk and if you erect statues to Bandera, if you carry SS insignia on your helmets, if you have swastikas tattooed on your chest, and indeed, you have SS insignia sewn into your uniforms, then you are Nazis. It doesn't matter whether that the president is a Jew. Anyway, let's just finish off the Times. The move is also a significant step for Mr. Zelensky, Ukraine's first Jewish president, in formalizing the national commemoration of a figure criticized as a Nazi. Again, he criticized. Criticized as a Nazi collaborator, while also honored in Ukraine as an independence fighter. So apparently, you get criticized as a I don't think Nazi collaborators should be criticized. I mean, you can't criticize. I mean, they're criticized as if this is something that well, some people criticize it, some people don't. Well, you take your pick. I would say that all rather depends. It's a matter of taste. You take. Do you want to. You want to collaborate with the Nazis. You don't want to collaborate, but it's criticized. Apparently, maybe it's not even a legitimate line of criticism. Hey, well, everyone, to each according to his taste. So here's while honored in Ukraine as an independence fighter. All right, so that's the 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 Melnyk was returned reburial. This is quite a ceremony, reburial. Zelensky takes the knee before the tomb of this great hero, and the Times essentially whitewashes this. Now, keep in mind how many times the Times would write about how Trump was really an admirer of Hitler's, all without any evidence whatsoever. But the Times would run endless articles about this, entirely kind of made up. No one's ever really been able to find any evidence at all of Hitler, of Trump expressing any admiration for Hitler. Think about the number of times that stories that the Times has run because some guy at the Alternative für Deutschland party had used the phrase that supposedly had been used by the Nazis in the 1930s. Nobody really knows this, but the Times apparently dug this up. Oh, this guy, this obscure guy in Eastern Germany, he's one of the leading figures in the AfD, and he used the phrase that had been used by the Nazis in the 1930s. That, but here you actually have a collaborator, a criminal involved in Nazi crimes. He just gets criticized. I mean, it's, maybe it's fair, maybe it's not fair. Who knows? And that's other times. Maybe it's just an unfair criticism. So, that's the way the Times presents it. Anyway, let's now go to our locals page, and this is the locals community. And as I always say, when we get to to our community, that I say this to all those who watch us on on YouTube and on X, and we're very grateful that you follow the Gaggle. Please, if you want me to address your comments, you ask me questions. I see some people ask questions on YouTube. I can't, I just don't have the ability to address those questions on YouTube, and there's too many, and I have to focus on what I'm saying. So, but if you want me to address your questions, if you want me to comment on your ideas, your observations, I'd be very happy to do so. But please join our community, the Gaggles community. That's where you can talk to me. That's where you can ask me questions. So if you want to interact with me, please join the Gaggle.locals.com. I'll say it again, the Gaggle.locals.com. Please join. Great people here, great community, very talented people. So you'll find it very much, very much worth your time. Anyway, first question is, of course, from one of our earliest supporters and one of our most prolific contributors to the Gaggle, which is from Danuki. And Danuki says, Kedvesh George, dear George, riddle me this logic. Why would you predominantly bomb ostensibly civilian targets of lower strategic value, which only further demonizes you on the global propaganda stage, while your enemy selects significantly higher strategic value targets like oil depots, terminals, refineries, ports, military industrial complexes, etc.? All right, well, I think I know where you're going with this. I have to agree with you that it is very bizarre why Russia, which has been throwing all of this drones and missiles and whatnot in Ukraine, don't seem to hit the same kind of high value military industrial strategic targets that Ukraine seems to hit. And, Ukraine seems to hit refine. I mean, not over the weekend, and Ukraine also hit civilian targets. No question that's an example of what the teachers training college, the dormitory. I mean, that's a civilian target, and Ukraine does hit civilian target, but Ukraine also does hit strategic targets, and particularly military headquarters. Apparently, only yesterday, Monday, Ukraine did attack with the British Storm Shadow missiles. They attacked the Russian military headquarters in Lugansk, obviously a legitimate military target. I don't know. I don't know why Russia doesn't do this. Now, one theory, and I think it's the one I entertained earlier this evening, is that they've been concerned about killing NATO personnel. I don't know why they would be concerned, but it's a possibility that they've been concerned that if they hit some military headquarters in Ukraine, then they might just kill a whole bunch of NATO generals. I think that's quite likely, but I don't care. I mean, Russia obviously is very wary, understandably, but very wary of escalating this war, and so therefore they've been reluctant to hit certain targets in Ukraine. I don't really understand that logic at all, and particularly as if this whole operation, which the Russians called the SMO, the Special Military Operation, particularly as this is that the Russians themselves launched it. I mean, if you're going to launch something like this, then you have to do whatever is necessary to win. I mean, there's no point in launching a war that you don't seem to be interested in winning. And that's it's very puzzling. I mean, if Ukraine can hit these targets, then why isn't Russia hitting these targets? And particularly in this case, it doesn't matter about the oil refineries and whatever. Hit all of the transport facilities that enable NATO weapons to be shipped into Ukraine. I mean, one would have thought that wouldn't be that difficult. Destroy all the railway tracks, destroy all the railway stations, the bridges. Then obviously destroy all the power stations. Make sure that the internet cannot function. Make sure that command and control is unable to function. I mean, I can see all of these targets would be strategic. I mean, they would obviously have humanitarian consequences if you knock out the power stations, but it will be a way to hit Ukraine's military. I mean, they do rely on electrical power, so we should take that out and prevent the command and control and the coordination with NATO. And if that doesn't work, then take out satellites. I mean, since these satellites, and Russia has repeatedly said, hey, the West is using satellites to guide missile systems to hit targets inside Russia. Okay, well, if these satellites are being used for that purpose, then take out the satellites. I mean, there are plenty of targets. So that's why, I have difficulties understanding where everybody gets very, very excited. The alt media gets very excited. Oh, Oreshnik this and Oreshnik that. Oh, fantastic. Oh, it's hypersonic. Oh. Who cares whether it's hypersonic? Who the hell cares that, it has all these, warheads. One missile has so many different warheads. Yeah, Russia already has plenty of missiles. Then there's no Russia doesn't need the Oreshnik. It doesn't need hypersonic missiles. It already has plenty of missiles. It already has plenty of drones. The issue is just use it for God's sake, and get this war over with. So I'm afraid I'm not. I can't get excited by any Oreshniks. But the issue is the targets are there. The targets are obvious where they are. What you need to do in order to bring this war to a conclusion, but Russia doesn't do it. Now, we discussed earlier in the day with these recent statements coming from the Russian foreign ministry. Maybe we should take them seriously. Maybe not. But one would hope that this is finally a decision has been taken in the Kremlin to inflict serious pain on Ukraine's military, and therefore to inflict serious pain on NATO, and to risk possible NATO retaliation and NATO going to war against Russia. I think the risk is remote, but it is real. I hope that that's the case, but you never know. I mean, we've been here before when we hear these threats, and then nothing happens. Anyway, thank you so much, Danaki. And then Aristotle, one apropos of Danaki's question, says, very good question. Perhaps it is showing a willingness to attack civilian infrastructure, including embassies in Kiev. What a mess on many levels, a pointless brother war. I agree, it's a fairly pointless war. I don't think they're going to hit embassies. I think the NATO is deliberately trying to suggest that Russia is threatening to hit embassies. Russia was not threatening embassies. What Russia was obviously doing was making clear that when we hit these Ukrainian targets, and as I say, these targets that from the, when we looked at that statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry, the question that immediately arose in my mind was, well, why didn't you hit them before? These all seem to be very, very good targets, very, very legitimate targets. You've had 4 years. Why didn't you hit those targets earlier? Oh well, these drone factories. Yeah, those drone factories should have been taken out long ago. Command and control centers. Yeah, military headquarters. All of that should have been taken out long ago. Why weren't they? And those are the questions I would think, I would hope, the Russian people are going to be asking. Hey, you ask us to make sacrifices, and the Russians have made great sacrifices, but then you don't you care more about what NATO thinks of you. You want to spare the lives of NATO people. Why? You're not sparing the lives of Russians. You're sparing the lives of NATO officers. Why are you doing that? Yeah. So anyway, thank you, Aristotle. Um, and then Petros says President Putin just visited China, but was there any treaty on power of Siberia 2 pipeline, especially or the tariff structure? If not, it remains at the memorandum of understanding stage. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a serious blow, and that's why I think all the talk about the special partnership between Russia and China really is more at the level of alt media rejoicing, alt media premature celebration. If you can't get this off the ground, and this has been going on for a long time, this power of Siberia to gas pipeline, and it's a very big deal. I mean, obviously, it's a huge project, requires a lot of investment. Um, and particularly as the European gas market is now close to Russia. That's not coming back. And Russia's obviously thinking about the future, and China is is an important market. And particularly now, when China is really in some trouble because of what's going on in the Persian Gulf. I mean, China obviously is quite dependent on oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. And the Chinese can see what the American plan is. The American plan is to bring the Strait of Hormuz under U.S. control. That doesn't mean that the Americans will succeed, but nonetheless, that's the plan. And they want to bring the Strait of Hormuz under control in order to squeeze China. Now, that the Americans are obviously doing that. Venezuela's gone. China's not getting any oil from Venezuela, and then America wants to take Iran off the chessboard, so that China's not going to get any oil from Iran. That's the American plan, and the Chinese know it. So therefore, Chinese need to get their energy from somewhere else, and Russia is the obvious place to get your energy. So in those circumstances, it's so much more bizarre that they weren't able to sign this Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline. The Chinese need the gas. The Russians absolutely want the Chinese market. They want to sell their gas now that they no longer have Europe. And they couldn't even get that. They couldn't even sign an agreement that was obviously to the benefit of both powers. Now, what the exact circumstances were, why they couldn't sign it, I'm not exactly certain. It sounds to me like the Chinese want to buy gas at such a cut price rate that for the Russians, it's just not worth their while to invest so much money in building this gas pipeline. The Chinese are trying to drive a hard bargain, and you can't put billions into a project if you're not going to get enough in terms of revenues in the long term. So that's why this deal hasn't been signed. Now, it seems very, very strange, and to me, Russia and China should long ago have become military allies, military partners, and energy allies and energy partners, because they're up against the United States. And contrary to all the nonsense about how America's finished, America's in decline, and it's all over for America. No, no, no. America is slowly putting the squeeze on both Russia and on China. It's a long process. What the Americans are trying to do, they're squeezing China, preventing China from getting its energy. As I say, Venezuela's out. Iran, they're planning on getting Iran out. We don't know what the outcome will be, but we'll see. And of course, they've been pushing Russia out. Europe is now an energy dependency of the United States. It used to be an energy dependency of Russia. It's now an energy dependency of the United States. And then the United States is now moving into Central Asia, and to push the Russians out of Central Asia and get their energy. And so they too will be getting their energy from the United States and not from Russia. This is a long-term project that the United States is waging. They said it's spelled out in their national security strategy document last year, which is we're going to use energy as a weapon. We're going to use it in order to enhance our power in the world, and that's exactly what they're doing. So in those circumstances, Russia and China need to pool their resources in order to be able to take on the United States, NATO, and their various allied and associate states in Asia. But that isn't happening, and therefore, if it doesn't happen, then then one after another is going to be picked off by the United States led West. I think that unless you pool all your resources together, then you're not going to be able to take on the United States. And contrary to, as I say, to the alt media, this meaningless podcasts that you go one after the other, which tell us about how China is now the number one economic power in the world. China is the number one military power in the world. None of that has any bearing on the truth. China will be lucky if it prevails, if it just manages to survive the push from the United States. Russia, I think, will be fortunate if it survives this push from the United States. So, I think I put off for a good while these wild prognostications from the other podcasts. No one is displacing the United States as the number one military, economic, and financial power in the world. Certainly not China. China, in particular, when it comes to military, is a joke. China hasn't even fought any war since 1979. How can you be a number one military power in the world if you haven't even fought a war since 1979? Therefore, nobody knows what your capabilities are. And even when they last did fight in 1979, they actually performed very poorly and kind of lost against the Vietnamese. So, there's a lot of wishful thinking, unfortunately, in this alt media sphere. Anyway, thank you so much, Samba Petros. And then Vic Shakapopoulos says, Dear George, after the EU loses, now it's time for little Marco to visit Yerevan. Yes, indeed. Yes, he went there to give his endorsement to Pashinyan. So the election, I think, is in about 10 days' time. So, yeah. What is the U.S. up to? Are Armenian and EU interests in the region identical? For all the talk about the US-EU political differences on this front, they appear to be working together. Yeah, absolutely agree with you. I think it's part of the project of pushing Russia out of the Near East and Central Asia. So the goal here, obviously, is to build this whole Trump the trip, the Trump transport network that's going to go through Armenia, that's going to link up the two parts of Azerbaijan. So the Nakhchivan, which is the Azerbaijani exclave, which is on the east part of Armenia. So that's going that by building this Trump transport hub, they're also minimizing Iran, because after all, this was also a way for Iran to conduct trade to the north, because and their access towards Russia and everything else. So that's going to go. That's the northern route that's gone once that transport hub is built. And of course, Armenia, it will be a very minor player in all this. It's not even clear that Armenia will survive. It's got, to the west, it has Turkey. We all know about what the Turks think of the Armenians, and to the east it has Azerbaijan, which of course claims the entire territory of Armenia as belonging to Azerbaijan. So Pashinyan has decided that he has no real choice but to throw in his lot with the EU and the United States. And he figures that, yes, he has Turkey to the west, he has Azerbaijan to the east. They're both threats, obviously threats to Armenia. But as long as he's in with the Europeans and as long as he's in with the Americans, they're going to save him. They're going to save Armenia, and uh, therefore he will Armenia will survive. I'm not at all sure about that. I don't think the Europe or the United States really give a damn about Armenia. It's like it just doesn't mean very much. It's a small country. It's a very poor country. I mean, there's some historic sentimentality about it, but they don't care that much about it. And we've already seen how little they care about Ukrainians. Ukraine only only matters as long as they can use it against Russia. And so Armenia only mattered as long as they can use Armenia to humiliate Russia, to push Russia out. So therefore, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then the ultimate prize here is Georgia, and that's not going to be that difficult. Georgia, all of them. This was these three former Soviet republics will be in the Western column. And that's, of course, in addition to all the other ambitions, which is, and that's when you create this route from Turkey through Armenia, through Azerbaijan, and then into the Far East, with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, all of that will be incorporated within the Western network, and all of them will be, of course, mobilized against China. And that's, of course, the idea. And that goes back to my previous point, is that China and Russia don't seem to realize how much the world is turning against them, how much through the American machinations, their former kind of, allies are going to be in the U.S. NATO camp. So so ultimately, yes, it's part of this the link from Europe into the Near East to Central Asia and ultimately the Far East, all under NATO U.S. auspices. And Armenia is just a small piece of the jigsaw there. So I think that's their goal. So yeah, they don't care about Pashinyan, but they're very happy that he has so much animus against Russia, and that he's so easy to be used against Russia. Now, Russia in part can also be blamed for what's happened, because they didn't provide any real support for Armenia. Now, there's no particular reason why they should, but nonetheless, the Armenians have a case. They are a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a kind of Russian-led military alliance that's their equivalent of NATO. So it was a member of that. Azerbaijan wasn't, and there is a supposedly historic friendship between Russia and Armenia, but Russia didn't do anything. when Azerbaijan launched its attack in 2020 and then again in 2023. And I mean, we still don't know exactly what game Russia was playing. Maybe they thought that somehow, um, by being friendlier with Azerbaijan than with Armenia, they would curry favor with Asia and Africa and the global South. Russia wants to be sets high store by being held in high esteem by the global South. I think it's a little crap, but the Russians care a great deal what the global South thinks. So they thought that maybe if we can um, show ourselves as well disposed towards a Muslim power, that's going to add to our prestige in the world. Of course, it didn't. Azerbaijan has treated Russia with utter contempt, treated Russian citizens. We talked about this. Remember, it arrested Russians. It threw out all manner of accusations against Russia, Russian interference in Azerbaijani affairs. So that didn't really work out. But the Russian calculation that we need to keep in with these Muslim powers because that adds to our prestige in the global South. It's not unlike the Western idea that we have to support the sort of the Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina or the Muslims in Kosovo because that's going to you know put us in in high in regard in the Muslim world, who hate us because we don't support the Palestinians. But hey, now they're going to think well of us because we support the Muslims of Bosnia. So some similar calculation. It was as stupid in America's case as it is in Russia's case. But so they basically didn't get anything from Azerbaijan, but unfortunately have now I think lost Armenia probably for forever is a long time, but it doesn't look like Armenia is ever coming back into the Russian fold. Anyway, thank you so much, Vic. And then Cynthia. It's always good to see you, Cynthia. So, as I would say, Cynthia is our film scholar, film expert, film encyclopedist, with an amazing, incredible knowledge of filmmaking and film history, and all of the minutiae, intricacies that are involved in film production. And she's developed an incredible knowledge of this, all kinds of films, all film genres, and different nationalities of films and everything else. And we are very fortunate to enjoy Cynthia's expertise here every week at the Gaggle. She always provides us with incredible briefings on the films that we screen here. Again, drawing upon her amazing knowledge of cinema, so she provides us with these really informative, fascinating briefings to go together with our screening. So every week we screen something on Monday, but it's available on the Gaggle locals page. So over the past few weeks, we've been screening films about the British Empire, and it's been one of our most popular um, projects. We've now screened a number of films, and next week will be the last of our British Empire films. So, but this week we're screening John Huston's classic, "The Man Who Would Be King," starring Sean Connery and Michael Caine. A very interesting film, and so very well much worth watching. It was made already in 1975, but Sean Connery and Michael Caine are both charmers. They're both very likable. So you always enjoy this film. And John Huston is obviously one of the great cinematic artists, as Cynthia points out in her learned commentary. So watch the film. It's freely available to all members of the Gaggle. And as you watch the film, enjoy Cynthia's commentary, that the two go very well together. You get a much better appreciation and understanding of the film. So the man who would be king, and then and so enjoy it, and that's one of the great benefits of joining the Gaggle. The Gaggle.locals.com. You can watch movies every week and enjoy Cynthia's commentary. Anyway, so Cynthia's comment today is John Helmer argues Trump uses Kushner and Witkoff for back-channel diplomacy aligned with Kirill Dmitriev's efforts to link Western business interests with Russian oligarch wealth. He warns this treats the war like a real estate deal, pushing toward a managed stalemate or frozen conflict rather than a real resolution. He also says continued engagement with these Western channels could weaken Russia's credibility with its allies. Could this be part of a Trump trap to put Putin at a loss? I think that's right. I mean, I think that the idea that Trump was ever going to pull um, Russia's chestnuts out of the fire, that Trump was ever going to uh, apply real pressure against Ukraine, in order to get his good friend Putin out of the mess in Ukraine, I think was always far fetched. As that doesn't vitiate what I was saying earlier, that Trump isn't interested in this war in Ukraine, and that he doesn't think that it's his war. He thinks it's Biden's war. He thinks it's the Europeans' war. He thinks that it's a waste of time for the United States to get involved. That I think is all true. However, he also doesn't see it as any great priority for the United States to help anybody out, to help Russia out, to help Ukraine out, or to help the Europeans out. As far as he sees it, it's weakening everybody. He obviously wants to weaken Europe. Europe becomes an American dependency. That's obviously happening now. Every day, this part of an American plan started under Biden. It's continuing under Trump. Europe becomes an American dependency. Ukraine, he thinks, is completely a dependence, a totally worthless, parasitical, garbage state. However, they're paying money, or at least the Europeans are paying Americans money for weapon systems. The Americans, obviously they're running short on weapons, and that's something is a problem for the United States, that they are running out of missiles, they're running low on Patriot systems, and that's one of the unfortunate developments. So that will figure in Trump's calculations, how much he really wants to help Ukraine while he's still got this war in Iran unresolved. But I think, I've said this before, I think this war in Iran with Iran is going to be resolved. At least the kinetic part of it will be resolved in the near future. Trump doesn't see any real benefits to the United States from this war. So I think that will be resolved, and then they'll get back to trying to provide Ukraine with some weapons and systems. And then, of course, it does weaken Russia and weakens Russia as an energy power. And that, I think, it's also part of Trump and the U.S. plan, is to weaken Russia. Now, so what's the incentive for him to bring peace to Ukraine? How does that benefit him? I mean, he's going to, that's going to add votes to him in the midterms. I don't think so. Is anyone really going to vote in the midterms on whether the war in Ukraine has come to an end or not? I don't see it. I don't think Americans care that much about it. The only thing that I think Trump cares about, the only aspect of this that he cares about, is he doesn't want to be sucked in to a possible third world war with Russia. He really doesn't want to get into a situation where the United States will be forced to use weapons against Russia, certainly not nuclear weapons, but even conventional weapons, anything at all that involves some kind of an escalation against Russia, he wants to avoid. But this situation now, I don't think Trump has any particular incentive to end this. So Kirill Dmitriev is talking with these um, Witkoff and Kushner, and he's talking all these business deals. And Dmitriev seems to think that Trump is going to be seduced by this. I don't think he does, because I think Trump has enough sense to know that there aren't going to be any deals signed while this war is going on. So this whole talk about there's going to be all these fantastic business deals, well, Trump knows that it's not going to happen. I mean, until this war is resolved, no one's going to invest any money anywhere. He's going to invest money when Russia can't even prevent its oil refineries from being hit. He's going to invest money while oil depots are being hit, when transport infrastructure in Russia is being hit, while at the moment Ukraine is becoming the drone capital of the world. Why, no one's going to invest any money in those circumstances. So this is a fantasy that somehow they're going to work something out, Trump and the Russians, and they're going to think about, oh, Trump will be seduced by all this talk about business deals. It isn't going to happen. So, and I don't see any pressure on Trump to bring this to an end. He's under pressure to bring the Iran war to an end because that's the United States, that's America involved in this. But here, the involvement is indirect. The only thing that matters to Trump is that he avoid getting into a shooting war with Russia. Everything short of that, I don't think he has a problem with. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Stone River, nice to see you, Stone River. Thank you very much. He says, George, increasingly, political leaders in the West brazenly disregard the interests of their citizens, and those citizens seem to be oblivious and blasé in the face of it. Yep. Trump's 180-degree reversal as the peace president being the latest case in point. Yes. How do you explain this? Something to do with people becoming moronic in the age of distraction and the trivialization of everything? Well, it's it's an excellent question. And, it's hard to give a good answer to that. I mean, obviously, there's a mixture of factors. But I think what's become very clear, I mean, I wouldn't quite put it people becoming moronic. It's that the elites, the powers that determine political, social, economic, military policy have become extremely sophisticated in holding on to power. So if you recall, back in the 19th century, as states were abandoning their kind of, feudal systems of government, aristocratic systems of government, and were going over to the universal franchise, people used to think, well, how the hell are we going to keep in power? Because if you give people the vote, then all of the have-nots will basically vote the haves out, and will grab whatever's is going. So it became very, very difficult, and for a while, it wasn't at all clear that the Western political model was going to survive. There were powerful communist parties. There were general strikes. Even Great Britain, which never had a powerful communist movement, even Great Britain had to endure a general strike, and that sense of doom, and that the political systems of the democracies were unsustainable. That went on through into the 1980s, right all the way up to say in Britain, particularly into the Thatcher era, it wasn't at all clear that any government could survive against an organized, working class militancy. You had the miners' strikes that would have brought a government to its knees. You had, all of the continual strikes, and essentially it seemed like, well, an elected government will not be able to prevail against the political will of the masses, which was always the nightmare. Now, the and the same thing happened in Europe, where you ultimately you looked at the French Communist Party, the Italian Communist parties, and you think, well, sooner or later these parties, they're getting more and more powerful. They will be in power, and then they will take control of everything, just as the Bolsheviks did. So really, only up until relatively recently, we suddenly realized that, hey, these elites are here to stay. They can't be removed that easily. Up until the 1970s, I think you were thinking, yeah, they can be removed pretty easily. So what we now have is a system of government where it really doesn't matter for whom the people vote. That just you vote for one bunch of non-entities. They're replaced by another bunch of non-entities, and nothing very much changes. And the policies, however unpopular, continue. So here we have governments in the UK that tell the public, well, we don't have money for this, we don't have money for that, we have to come back on this, come back on that. But there's always money for Ukraine. And you would think, well, if ever there's an opportunity for some populist movement to say, hey, you mean there's no money for the National Health Service, but there's money for Ukraine? There's no money to heat the homes of old age pensioners, but there's money for Ukraine. We care about whether people in Kiev have heating, but we don't care about whether people in Bradford have heating. Well, yeah, apparently the government gets to decide. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Ukraine matters more to us than do the people who live here. And then you say, well, okay, well, what about you bring in all this cheap labor, all these migrants that you're bringing in. So essentially, you're hitting your own people. You're undercutting your own people. You're destroying your own country. Well, that should be the cry of any populist movement. Well, apparently it isn't. This guy in the UK, just dies in police custody. He was stabbed by a Sikh, but the police arrested the victim, and he died in police custody. And the police arrested him because they thought he was a racist. He was arrested for being a racist. He was basically bleeding to death in police custody. Not the Sikh. The Sikh walked away, but this young man who died in police custody for being a racist. Now you think, okay, well that's pretty bad. This is pretty shocking. Well, where are the mass protests? There were mass protests for George Floyd. Big demonstrations in London for George Floyd. And George Floyd's in Minneapolis in the United States, thousands of miles away from the UK. There were mass demonstrations. Yet there's nothing at all about this young man who dies, in his own blood, in police custody. This happened a few days ago. No demonstration, very little media coverage. Two-tier Keir, the Prime Minister of the UK, has said nothing. Two-tier Keir took the knee over George Floyd. Two-tier Keir. He wasn't Prime Minister then. He was the leader of the opposition, but he took the knee for George Floyd. So how do we explain for this? Well, because there are certain kinds of demonstrations that are sanctioned by the authorities. Apparently, it's fine to protest about racism, whatever that means. You go just protest about racism, that's fine. But you shouldn't protest about a citizen of your own country who dies in police custody and who is alleged to be a racist, even though there's no evidence that he was a racist. The only allegation that he's a racist came from the Sikh, who incidentally was allowed to carry a knife, because knives are, of course, banned in the UK. But the Sikh was allowed to carry a knife because apparently it's part of their religious custom to carry fancy knives. So he was with this fancy knife that this young Englishman was stabbed to death. But if you want to protest that, then you're going to have two-tier Keir breathing down your neck. You remember when two-tier Keir issued this really repugnant short statement on video, warning about troublemakers who apparently were coming to the United Kingdom because basically were saying, we want our country back. No, 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 no. We basically is threatening to unleash the police against the people who say, hey, our country is being taken away from us. And of course, you remember when two-tier Keir sent all the people to prison who were protesting the murder of those three little girls in Southport. So that, long story short, the ruling elites have learned how to manipulate the masses. These are the demonstrations that we accept. We sanction these demonstrations. These are the demonstrations we don't accept. We throw those people in prison. This you can accept. This you can sanction. This you imprison. And that's Trump. As obviously he lied to his the supporters. Is very unpopular. But what's really important is that he has continued the prevailing policy, the prevailing foreign policy, and that's all that mattered. So he, of all people, a populist who rode to power, promising serious change, saying he was turning his back on the Bush era, the McCain era, Obama era. Everything was going to be different. And yet he's done, it's just showed everything continues as before. You don't like it, you'll find all sorts of things can be done against you. In Britain, you can get yourself stabbed or you can get yourself thrown into prison if you don't like it. In the United States, you don't like it, you're going to have millions thrown against you in an election, or worse. Like that Thomas Massey, obviously a very decent politician, very decent populist, a man of principle. Well, he's been voted out. How has democracy benefit from it? Well, of course, it hasn't. It showed the irrelevance of democracy because, of course, he was a genuine populist. But once you have so many millions thrown against you, well, that just shows you the limits of elections and therefore the limits of democracy. Anyway, I mean, it's a long, fascinating subject. So those are my kind of initial thoughts about your question. Thank you so much for your generosity. And Robert, always very good to see you, Robert. And wonder how things are going New Jersey. Is it still thinking about the return of Chris Christie? Is that still on the cards? Anyway, Robert says after the Israeli pager strike, many assumed Hezbollah was finished. Yet the paradox is that Hezbollah's strongest showing against the IDF may have come after the decapitation of its hierarchy. Forced into a more network structure and armed with FPV drones, it appears to become harder to detect, target, and suppress. Iran shows similar tendency. Does this suggest a broader shift in political and military authority from hierarchical to network forms? I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, I tend to think that Iran has proven to be quite quite well organized. I don't think it's um, I don't think there's that much decentralization. I think it's proved to be, very, very well organized, very well coordinated, and very effectively led. And it may be, and I don't know. I mean, it may be that when you do these decapitation strikes, you actually eliminate a more moderate, more reasonable leadership, and then you replace them by a much more ruthless, um, smarter leadership that actually isn't taken in by by any kind of Western entreaties. We'll have to see in the case of, I mean, Hezbollah has always been a tough nut to crack for Israel. It's never really made much headway. Um, and so the the idea of somehow, if you remove the leadership, that the organization collapses. It just that isn't it just doesn't work. It hasn't really worked anywhere. um I mean, if you think of, let's say, in the Soviet leadership, Stalin purged the entire Soviet hierarchy during the 1930s. That was boom, at every level, within the military hierarchy, the NKVD hierarchy, within every ministry, within the party, the entire hierarchy was swept away. And Hitler assumed that, well, the Soviet Union will be completely ineffective. This is a war we should be able to win pretty easily, because the entire leadership at every level of government has just been swept aside. So therefore, you're going to have young, incompetent people who don't know what the hell they're doing. So we should be able to win this pretty easily. It turned out to be quite, the opposite was the case. You actually put some younger, ruthless people in charge. They proved to be quite effective. And the Germans obviously got a nasty surprise. It would have been the same, incidentally. Let's say if the British had succeeded in assassinating, say, Hitler and Goering and Goebbels, or I don't know, think of the top Nazis during the war. I think the Nazis would probably been a more effective fighting force. You could have absolutely brought to the fore a whole cadre of much more effective, much smarter Nazi leaders than you had before. So in a way, it was good not to go for the assassination option. So something similar may be happening now. Somebody like these people in Iran. You get rid of the old man Khamenei. You haven't gained anything. Khamenei was probably one of the reasonable ones. He was the one who actually wanted to come to an agreement. Now you got a much tougher brand of leaders who say, we don't want to come to an agreement. We're not just going to trust the Americans. We've been burned too many times. So I think something like that may be going on there. So be careful what you wish for. You get you remove one set of leaders, you might actually have a much more effective set of leaders taking over. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And then here we have, and then Robert says, Krista Freeland was just mercilessly heckled during her book promotion tour over Gaza, Canada's Israel policy. Well, that's nice. I mean, I'm happy about that. Awful person. And then Aristotle 1, thank you so much, says exactly, George, China's mercantile blinkers are even more ludicrous than Russia's constant appeal to its partners. I think that's right. The mercantile thing is particularly dumb because you can't have you can't run an export-driven economy in perpetuity because other countries aren't going to put up with it. I mean, the whole notion that you can just do this and then, oh, well, we're not going to buy anything from anyone. We're just going to have our own, our own get mercantilist foreign policy. Well, that isn't going to work. Just that's not that. America succeeds because it doesn't pursue that policy. But China has been doing that, and it's a source of vulnerability, and particularly it's a source of vulnerability. First of all, obviously they're vulnerable on the energy front, but they're vulnerable on this building up this huge trade surplus. And they have the experience of what happened to Japan. Japan had this exactly the same idea. Um, back in the 1960s and 70s, hey, we're just going to build up a great trade surplus and we're going to become the leading economic power in the world. And well, sooner or later, the rest of the world just says, no, you're not going to do it. You're not going to wipe out our industries. We're not going to put up with it. So that was always going to be the case in China. And China is, I think, much more vulnerable than Japan was because at least Japan had built up its own domestic industries. China hasn't done that. China is dependent on other foreign companies investing in China, which means they depend on Apple, and BMW, and everyone building their giant plants in China. But anyway, thank you, Aristotle. And then Aristotle says, interesting how all the cool kids are fixated with the Palestine conflict, but are oblivious about what IA, it's not IA, what is going on in Ukraine, cartoon grade politics. I agree. I absolutely agree. That it's something that's very, very, very dangerous in all sorts of ways. And yeah, unfortunately, the cool kids are not paying attention to that. Anyway, thank you so much, Aristotle. Really appreciate that. And my time is up. And thank you very much, everybody who would join me. Thank you for all of your really interesting comments, questions. And as I always say, if you want to engage with me, you want to ask me questions, you want challenge me, please join our community, the gaggle.locals.com, and I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. And the dogs, they're going to be waking up soon. They're going to be complaining, but that's it. Thank you so much, everybody who contributed to the tip jar. I really appreciate that. And we'll be back Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much. See you then. All the best. Good night. Bye-bye.